Good afternoon and welcome to Poetry Festival Singapore 2020. My name is Margaret Devadason and it's an honor to be facilitating this panel entitled The Changing State of Singapore Poetry. We have some wonderful panelists here today and I will start by introducing them. Koh Tai An is Professor and Senior Associate at NTU's Center for Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. She has published widely on Singapore literature, arts and culture, most recently in The State and the Arts in Singapore, Policies and Institutions, and edited Singapore Chronicles Literature. It includes her chapter, First Language, Second Tongue, Singapore Literature in English. Her pioneering, comprehensive, up-to-date digital Singapore literature in English, an annotated biography, has received over 46,000 visits worldwide. Desmond Kon is the author of a novel, quasi-memoir, 6 hybrid works, and 9 poetry collections. A former journalist, he has also edited more than 20 books. Recipient of the IBPA Benjamin Franklin Award and Singapore Literature Prize, Desmond helms Squircle Line Press as its founding editor. Lastly, we have Yeow Kai-chai, who is a poet, fiction writer, and editor. He has 2 poetry collections, Pretend I'm Not Here and Secret Manta. A co-editor of Quarterly Literary Review Singapore, he served as festival director of the Singapore Writers' Festival from 2015 to 2018. Welcome, everyone. So I would like to start by asking you all, obviously you spent a lot of time involved with poetry in Singapore, but how did you get started? What was your first encounter or involvement with poetry?
I guess it was in primary school. I think there was a journal called Student World. I don't know any of you are old enough, but Prof might know. It's a Student World. It's a literary creative writing journal that's targeted at primary school kids. So I submitted kind of a poem and I won something. So it's like 10 Sing dollars, something like that. I was thrilled. So that was my first encounter of with poetry as a viable option outlet for creativity.
Some of my favorite poets were Auden, Plath, E. Cummings, and when I started teaching, I took some of my favorite poems and started using them, so, yep.
Well, I'm the only one who is not a poet here and not a writer. Basically, my profession has been as a literary critic and literary scholar. As a child, I read a lot of what would now be considered trash. Enid Blyton, the Biggles Boys, girls' school adventures and the like. But I found that I enjoyed reading the texts that we were given in school, and I found I could appreciate them very much, even though they seem very different from the kind of stuff that I've been reading, comics and so on, Beano, right? And at university was when my interest in literature was really woken, particularly given the excellent teachers we had, like the famous poet D.J.N. Wright. Right. And my first article about Singapore literature was when I was commissioned to write an article on cultural identity and tradition in Singapore writing. And that was way back in 1979 when I was still an assistant lecturer. That's how my interest in Singapore literature grew.
That's wonderful. So Tyann, you've just mentioned that you are a literary critic and scholar. If I could just call on Desmond and Kai-chai to comment briefly on what kind of roles poetry has played in your life as educators, organizers, publishers even.
Well, I think Des and I have something common. We all sort of started in 8 Days magazine. That's an entertainment magazine. So I guess creative writing generally is imagination, right? So writing for entertainment magazine, music, movies takes a different part of the brain. But creative writing, poetry, short stories, is another brain. So another side of the brain. So I always treat it as 2 sides of the same brain, and you have to exercise both sides in order to let your full self be realized. Otherwise, you would be writing workshop to a T. You're writing by numbers. I think Des can speak for himself. I'm sure he will tell you what he thinks.
I mean, what I find interesting about Kai Chai's work is that even as a music reviewer, as a journalist, a lifestyle journalist, that he actually uses pop culture references and infuses them in his poetry, which is an astonishing sort of way of contemporarizing the lyric, right? For me, I like to do that as well. But for me, being a poet has really changed the way I look at the world. The whole world is like a huge sort of matrix of simulacra, right? And everything is about meaning making, and I'm always trying to go to poetry to interrogate how meaning is made. I love post-structuralism, so I like the flux of meaning, how relative it can seem, but more importantly, I'm very interested in the limits of art and language. What can't we do? And I'm interested in using poetry to write about what might seem unsayable or inexpressible. Yeah.
Well, my encounters with poetry and Singapore literature, it's very unsimilar to theirs, being a literary critic. When we were at the university, Singapore literature was not a very big body of work, and we as literary critics and scholars of the literature were in a way pioneers. I, for instance, started building up bibliographies. I started writing about poets even as they were emerging. For instance, when I was writing this article on Singapore literature in English and the cultural identity and tradition, at the end of which a new voice appeared, Boey Kim Cheng, and I included him, right? And we had Commonwealth literature was a big thing in those days. So at conferences, we would talk about these new writers, and they gradually became known. And in a way, what we were doing were identifying what will eventually turn out, if they continued with their writing, to be the canonical writers of the Singapore literature canon, right? So in a way, we in the English department, myself included, were very instrumental in creating this canon. I, for instance, was for many years a judge of the national poetry competition. I was on the panel which discovered Claire Tham and Philip Jeyaretnam, okay, and later on, I was on the panel which discovered Rex Shelley, right? So in that way, because of our profession, and people's trust in our judgment and inviting us to be judges, we were able, therefore, to promote the writers and to make known the writers whom we thought, were promising, wrote well. And in fact, Rex Shelley went on to write 3 more novels, right? And Boey Kim Cheng, of course, the rest is history, right? He is now a leading poet. And we are glad to say, seen the promise, right? On the other hand, we might have also been very critical, and mentioned that, perhaps this could be tweaked this way, or perhaps this, and so on. Of course, there's my notorious review of Robert Yeow's first volume of poems, all right, which has become, as it were, urban history, okay, written when I was, in fact, just a PhD student, right? But because of who I've become now, it seems as if I'm still judging him, which is not true, of course, because he's still talking about it. But the thing is, at the same time that his book appeared, so did Arthur Yap's first volume by the same publisher. And that got a deservedly glowing review by one of our PhD students, Nanama Winslow. So that's my encounter with the early years of Singapore writing. And I've seen it grow, and my bibliography has grown along with it. So that there is now a substantial body of work that is actually internationally known.
That's really incredible. So, if I can ask more generally, apart from seeing new voices emerge, how do you all feel you've seen Singapore's poetry scene evolve while you've been a part of it? So, Desmond and Kai Chai, you mentioned incorporating pop culture references into your writing. Does that, for you, need to change as you continue writing?
So Kai Chai, as SWF director for so many years, you should have the bird's eye view of what's been happening.
Oh, okay, so I'm sorry. The trends in. I would say the main influence or the main factor is the advent of the internet. the advent of digital media that really democratizes the spread or the availability of poetry to everyone. Because honestly, I think, Prof, you will agree with me that the idea of Singapore poetry was at one point largely endorsed by academia, right? And it's really a few people in the academia who kind of like endorses certain people, right? And that's how, I mean, I was also one of the students who went through the doors of the Singapore NUS, the FASS, and Lang and Lee department. And obviously, Wei Kim Cheng was in the honors year when I was a freshman. So I mean, these were like heroes of mine. But I think what really was something that I need to credit was the people like Alvin Pang, Aaron Lee, and a few of those people who started writing on their own away from the academia. Was in the late 1990s when they started publishing by Ethos, by Landmark. So I think suddenly they realized that they could find their own avenues, audiences. So I think that would be the main thing. As for pop culture, some of us do, some of us don't. I still feel there's another school that is very Anglo and very lyrical, and some became very confessional, and LGBT issues came up. And then some of us went into more experimental, maybe more influenced by American poetries. Then after that, I will leave it to Des to explain.
Yeah, I think Kai Chai brought up two very good points, that of the books being published, and in the last 20 years, since 2000, there have been lots more poetry publishers, like Math Paper Press, and then First Fruits, after Ethos, right? But also, interestingly, the spoken word performance poetry scene really took off with Chris Muni Singh, and we've seen them really hold their own, and they're doing absolutely divine work. We've seen Stephanie Chan, Deborah Emanuel, Pooja Nancy came from there, Mark Nair, and now they've gone on and crossed over to write books and been remarkable in their poems on the page as well as on the stage. And now new media as well. So internet is a big deal to have that reach. I remember in like 2002, the audiences could be so dismal, but now you actually have people turning up full houses for poetry readings, which is really, really very exciting for writers here, I like it that there are a few small groups that have come up that previously we were always seen as like the pioneer generation, generations of poets, but then with the Daryl W.J. Lim, Amanda Chong, Samuel Lee, Jennifer Ann Champion, Zi Hao Guang, we had the image symbolists. We've also got Zero Sleep. We've had Saber, which has come up with very good writers like Valen Lim, Max Pasacon, Jack C. And so these small groups are very interesting, and Crispin Rodriguez and Joseph are in one as well. So just really nice to see more diversity, more inclusivity, and everyone just doing what they love. Yep.
Yes, I agree with both of you that the literary scene, particularly the poetic scene, has become very diversified. The poets coming from and starting very young, from from everywhere, right? They could be editors, they could be writers, dancers, they could be in the technology sector, right? In the business sector, corporate sector, and so on. Now, I see several trends from my perch in academia. One is the key, the 1989 report, the Ong Ting Cheong report, which saw the setting up of the National Arts Council. And much of this has flowed, many of these developments have happened because there has been financial backing. In the early years, people did their own thing, had great difficulty getting themselves published, and so on. If you read my little book here, I thought maybe I'll shamelessly now advertise it. Okay, it's called Singapore Literature, and it's a primer. And in it, you will find separate chapters, plus an introduction by me, a chapter by me on Singapore writing in English, plus chapters on Malay, Tamil, and Chinese literature. Given that this poetry festival is multilingual, it would be very good to see Singapore literature in English in relation to all the other literatures. And translation, I think, will be a very big thing. Anyway, if you look at that, I do give my take on the current developments in Singapore writing. And one of the main things I make is the creation of the NAC, and which led to the funding of things like the Creative Arts Program in NUS, which saw the nurturing of talents, right, like Theophilus Quack, and all the younger generations went through this, what I would call a virtual academy, right. At the same time, there's been funding available for publications. 1992, the Singapore Literature Prize was instituted, and it has developed it began with a prize for fiction, because it was found that fiction should be encouraged. There have been a lot of poetry being written and being talked about, and there was time for more fiction to be written. And then it grew to include all the other languages, right? Now, the other thing that has happened is that because of more funding available, poets have been able to travel overseas, right? And one way of canon formation is the poets whose work gets known, is seen to be good, and are invited to read overseas. The other development I've seen, which was so rare in our time, and partly because of the growth of the internet too, is that poets are getting published in many journals all over the world. If you look at the CV of the younger poets, Desmond, and Theophilus, and so on, you'll see that they have been published in 10, 12 different journals. In our time, this was unthinkable. Maybe one journal, two, and you would think, Journal of Commonwealth Literature, Westerly, and that's about it, Ariel in Canada, right? So that's one development. The third, of course, is the internet, as has been pointed out, has made it possible for writers with very few resources. One young writer, with as little as $3, managed to get her self-publish a book on a blog and got thousands of readers, to her great amazement, right? So, oh dear, I'm so sorry. I thought I switched it off. Oh, so sorry about that. I thought I had switched off. This was a reminder, right? Yes, where was I? Yes. So what has happened is that not only that, the poets seem to have grown up in the competitive atmosphere of Singapore. So they go out to promote their own work. They accept invitations readily, and unlike academics, they are not shy, as it were, to go to all kinds of different readings. And there are very many opportunities. It was Gopo Singh who started the practice of having poetry readings in a cafe. And now it's almost quite common, right? And Haji Lane, for instance, I've seen readings of poems. And as you said, nowadays there are many young people who are writing poems. And there, of course, is Singlet Station, right, with its month-long, boot camp or writers' workshop, where everyone who is interested can sit down and be mentored and produce poems and then get them published. And one of the features of such high production of poetry is that it's very difficult to sift the trees, to see the wood for the trees. There are so many voices, so many anthologies, right? And it's very difficult, for individual voices to emerge quite strong. Like, for instance, when Boey Kim Ching published, suddenly, he was a new voice, different from the others. So it's far more difficult now, it seems to me, for a poet to make his or her presence felt, right? And the suspicion I have is, they're all writing poetry, are they reading poetry? Are they reading the classics? Because there is so much of it, and there are not enough literary editors, for instance, who could help these young would-be poets who want to publish, navigate their way in the publishing world. And they might publish too soon, right? Because they want to make their name and stand out from among the others. So at the moment, I see a lot of poetic activity, and my question is, are there readers?
That's a very good point.
I think there's more of everything, yeah. So maybe there's just more crap stuff, but there are also more gems. overall, I think there are more people reading. In my opinion, compared to my time, which is the late 1990s, the very fact that an event like this, I think this is basically an in-person attendance. Essentially, just the attend. Yeah, very unlikely you would see other people. So actually, when you compare, I mean, as the festival director of the Writers Fest, I can see the growth. Just purely, these are people who otherwise I would be like, oh, why would they be here? They'll be rather shopping at Plaza Sing something. But they're here. So overall, I would say the quantum has been enlarged. Also, it just means that proportionately there might be more not so good stuff, but then occasionally there are gems. So I think overall it comes to territory. Yeah, just that you need to learn. I think maybe what's lacking is the critical literature, how to critique. I just say, in order to read, right? In order to critique, you need to read. So in order to know what's bad, you need to know what's good. You need to read basically everything. So, but I think overall kids these days are more interested in writing poetry, even if lit take-up rate is somewhat lower. I don't know whether it's
Yes, that is true. What is really lacking here, before I give the mic to you, Des, is a climate of a literary culture where books are regularly reviewed and discussed. Where, and this is the problem, a language problem too, because my very first article talks about what is our literary tradition. It is a tradition that began, first of all, with the British, and now more and more writers are referencing the American. Des, for instance, okay, American writers and American pop culture. But where are the literary critics? There's a great distance. There are the literary critics in academia who publish, right, for other academics and whose books are not accessible, sometimes very expensive, to the general public, right? Where is the common reader, for instance, to whom we might cater for and to whom we might act as guides among these many, many different poets? Okay, in the old days, it was when a new voice appeared, those of us who were trained in literature could see quality, right? Nowadays, there's so much, and there are not people doing the reading and the sifting, right? You do need people, right? And they need not be academics. They could be just well-read individuals. Like, for instance, poet Serial Wong, who has a PhD, by the way, I think, in literature, and Ko Ji Leong, who has a degree in literature from Oxford, right? These are poets who are also very well-versed in the literature. And therefore, when they read other poets and write about them, right, their analysis and so on, right, do teach the reader how to, in a way, approach the poets, the writers that they are writing about. We could have more of this, I think, right? Our English literary press doesn't have a literary supplement, for instance, equivalent to the Times Literary Supplement. Although I must admire QLRS, right, for the work that they are doing, but they are so low profile and very modest. Okay, I wish they would come out in print, or they would have sometimes hold a conference and say, here we are, and this is the good work we're doing. Please read us.
To add, about your comment about writers going abroad, I think Singlet Station has this amazing vision, and a lot to do with Joshua Ip and Charlene Shepardson helming it now. They just had SiPoRaimo. The SingPoRaimo is just a runaway success every year, but they've expanded SiPoRaimo so that we have so much writing coming from Southeast Asia, and so much dialogue and conversation that I've really just never seen before. And recently they had a whole digital sort of project where they had writers talking about books through Instagram, right? So I think they're making such amazing inroads with their vision, and it's just remarkable. It's really, really healthy. Yep. Back to you, Margaret.
So, more generally, you've mentioned the need for criticism, the need for readers, the need to read the classics. If you had the chance to make a wish, what you hope will happen in terms of Singapore poetry's evolution, what would you like to see?
Well, first of all, it's amazing, but Singapore doesn't have a literary journal for the literature in English, right? Equivalent, say, for instance, in Malaysia, the Southeast Asian Review of English, on which I'm I'm a member of the editorial advisory board, and I've been a guest editor. Oh, sorry, a guest editor, and Singapore Southeast Asian Review of English. And the only one that I mentioned earlier is the QLRS, which is the Quarterly Literary Review of Singapore, which models itself, on say the Times Literary Supplement, the New York Book Review, London Review of Books, right? And in fact, it's a very serious and excellent journal and ought to be better known. But we had Singer, but which ceased publication, I think, around 2000, after Yeow was one of the editors. Which brings us to an issue in Singapore in that we have a literature in 4 languages. So when there is a national journal, there is a tendency that it must be catered to all 4 languages, which Singer does. But then where are your core readers, right? And the other development that has happened is that willy-nilly, English has become the lingua franca, if not the national language of Singapore, right? Everybody now above the age of 50, right? 50 and below, maybe older, can read English. So in a sense, the literature in English reaches potentially every Singaporean. Whereas in some ways, the literatures in the other languages reach only those who are effectively bilingual or exceptionally competent in the first language or mother tongue. Right? So to talk about literature in Singapore, therefore, becomes very fraught, because we then have to bring in the ideology of multilingualism and multiculturalism, right? Whereas, and we cannot claim the literature in English as the national literature, right?
So what I'd like to see is that more workshop opportunities. I give a lot of workshops outside of academia, like in this wonderful space, the Arts House, and I get to meet people from all walks of life, not just people studying literature, and that's an amazing opportunity to see new voices get included when they write. Another thing is more non-profit organizations. We've got the Book Council, which does amazing work, and just had the whole Singapore Literature Prize ceremony online. They did a fabulous job with it, on which dear Kai Chai was one of the judges. That would be nice. And Singlet Station is also a great non-profit, word forward. But finally, I think the one thing before I pass to Kai Chai is, I hope that there's a real understanding of art making, being art for art's sake, culture for culture's sake. That alone should be prized and valued, right? We shouldn't have to do it for any other reason than for its very intrinsic value.
To add to all of what they have just said, I think I do want to commend, like, say, Singlet Station, tracking changes. So initiatives like this, which kind of demystify the craft of writing, that is actually quite a lot of hard work, a lot of revision, a lot of, like, it's not romantic, like, oh, it just came to my mind. Maybe it did come to your mind in a dream, but when you actually read it, it's like, oh my God, this is unreadable, right? So it comes with a lot of discipline, a lot of rewriting. So the more we treat it as a serious pursuit, that writing is not something that you can wink it, although some really talented one may initially cruise by, but I think to do well, to excel at it, you need to put a lot of hard work. So Singlet Station does this training very well. The book camp thing, journals such as QRS, such as Tiger Moth Review, these are the journals which sort of focus on certain niche things. So I think the eco-poetry. So in a way, they are also tap into the universal trends, which I like. But also on the other hand, they are very cognizant of local issues. I do like the fact that we engage internationally. So I like the fact that Theophilus is published overseas, right? Kafanet and Jileong, Alvin. So the very fact that we learned that actually what we write are equally as good as some of the people overseas, maybe even better. And also some of them are maybe not very good too. So you need training. Yeah. I think Margaret, you write very well too. Yeah.
Oh yes,
Just
Margaret's a fantastic poet.
You're too kind. Okay, so maybe moving back a little bit, while we think about the future, I'm interested in how that affects the way we think about the past. So you've all touched on a sense of democratization, a sense of diversification in the local poetic scene. And Tai'an, you've talked a bit as well about the process of canonization, of enshrining certain works as particularly iconic or influential. So I'm wondering, other than what you mentioned about having trouble seeing the wood for the trees, what kind of challenges or tensions do we see between a canon and the scene as it is evolving now?
Well, let me use the anthology as a starting point. Um, what we are now seeing at the moment, including for short stories, we have over 300 anthologies. And most of them have been published since the 1990s, again 91, 92, when publishing grants became available. And not only academics like Edwin Tambu were creating the anthologies, um, poets, even young poets, as young as Theophilus Quek, have also become editors and compilers of anthologies. So what we are seeing happening in these anthologies is that the one way that they get to be created is there will be an open call, and aspiring people will submit, and there will be a theme. And these young compilers, usually non-academics, will select, right? And it will be a mix, of maybe half of established poets like Desmond, Kai Chai, Shu Hong, Paul Tan, and so on. And then a host of unknowns, right? The hope is that among these, if they appear often enough in enough anthologies and journals, they might make up a collection that will soon see their voice, a new voice emerging. Until you have a collection, it's very difficult for your voice to be heard. Because after all, well, as Auden say, poetry makes nothing happen, right? But it's a mouth, it's a voice, okay? And each voice is unique. It has something to say to the world, something valuable, that we should not miss, and opportunity should be available for these voices, as it were, to be heard. So anthologies, it seems to me, is one way. The other way is that poets get recognized in foreign journals, they get invited to speak at festivals. So that is another way where they become well known. And one feature of the poetry in Singapore today is how cosmopolitan it is, right? As Kai Chai and Desmond have pointed out, many of these poets now are being published abroad. And even Theophilus, winning national British poetry competitions, right? But if you look at those poems, they're not Singaporean in any way. They could be written by a British person, okay? And what I see now is because of the workshops, the book camps, the mentorships, creative arts programs, Singlet Station, much experimentation in forms, much expertise in putting poems together. But perhaps the individual voice could get lost. There is much of a muchness. One academic said the Singapore literary form is the lyric poem. Meditation, clean observation of details, and then reaction, right? And that seems to be the case. So you can read too much of these detailed descriptive things, okay, that could come out of this workshop where you are set a theme, for instance, to write on. So that's the dangers, it seems to me. Although I agree with you, the valuable work that workshops can do, it also has this downside.
Yeah. That's a huge question, Margaret, and thank you for your insight, Tai-An. But, Tai-An, sent us an email with a series of questions about the assumptions of the canon. And it was interesting, your first question was to examine what is meant by the literary canon. And yeah, the literary canon is this body of work that is compiled by primarily literary critics, scholars, teachers. And if you look at the etymological root of the word canon, it comes from Greek and it means measuring rod or standard. And I find that a bit worrying, right? Because then people are going to look at the canon and say, how does my voice rank, right, in relation, or look in relation to the canon? And that's when we want to ask if the canon is where it should be, includes what should be in there or what's excluded from the canon. And the canon across the world has always been fiercely contested. And as a youngish republic, a previous colony, and a place that's home to migrants from our very beginning, I'd like to ask the question if we're now suffering from canon anxiety. Are we anxious about what is in the canon? And we need to ask ourselves why, if we're anxious, and what we'd like to see in the canon. I think that it's very important for any country, any state, to have historical memory and a cultural past, especially in a country like ours where you have a lot of new citizens. New immigrants do not naturally share that sort of canon because they've come from their own cultures and their own homes. So in a country that constantly has an evolving population, I think the canon probably will evolve as well. We've seen that with a lot of migrant writers, and their voices are markedly different aesthetically, content-wise as well. But I'll pass it to, I've got a lot to talk about this, but I'm sure there'll be another question. So Kai Chai, what do you think?
When I think the word canon, I think of that instrument, the military instrument, just to smash everything. That's all I care about. I don't really think very much about the canon because what I write has never been accepted until maybe, I don't know, maybe never, I don't know. The point is, canon to me is a beautiful word that is imposed. I guess it's useful when you're growing up and you're studying to know what is canonized, but you also have to understand why they are canonized. And they are also canonized because they are imposed by a certain kind of Anglo-Saxon sensibility that you read Shakespeare, you read all this. But to be honest, if they are good, they should be read. So if they're canon or not, doesn't really matter. That said, there are great works that are equally good, but they're not canonized. Then that's where you should question the canon and say, why don't you include this? So canons are never static, right, as everybody said. So we'll just have to not take it too seriously, but I think useful for someone who is studying literature to know what are great works of art, at least recognized over time. Some of them are really good, but some of them are problematic, maybe because suddenly certain issues may become like, brown face, whatever, black, whatever. All kinds of issues may come up that may make works of Larkin problematic, right? The anti-Semitic comments by him and everything. So that's the beauty of canon. The canon will have to be redefined by the people who come after them. So that's c'est la vie. That's how things are. So I don't really think we need to worry so much about canon.
Well, the canon is important because it, you could see it from a national point of view. That is a body of work that a community owns and is proud of, because the canon is generally considered to include the best, right? So in Singapore, a very neat encapsulation of the canon is this poetry website called poetry.sg, where there are about 60, some of them non-Singaporeans, like Tiang Hong and Shirley Lim, but mostly Singaporeans, and our two friends are there, okay, right? And what happens is that you get included in this canon if you have a substantial body of work that has been accredited, as it were, or been agreed upon by you're being awarded prizes, you're being written about, you're being invited quite often to festivals to read. You submit works to journals, they get accepted. Okay, so I mean the best recognition in a way is that your books get studied in school and university syllabuses, though that not necessarily always guarantee that it's of the right of high quality, right? So that's where the issue of inclusion and omission comes in. The other kind of canon is the canon of individual poems, sorry. Okay, for instance, two poems that I think of, old poems, okay, but by non-Singaporeans, would be Rumba by Richard Ong and Dance by Farida Amin, right, which are tremendously lyrical, and which really, really move one when one reads them, right? But these two I do not know who Richard Ong is. He has not written any poems. So they would if you look at the anthologies, these poems, some of these poems keep on reappearing, right? Despite the poets being obscure, and they form the body of work that is loved by the readers of Singapore literature. So that's the other kind of canon. And as Yeats says, with regard to younger poets, in his poem Sailing to Byzantium, right, poets study the monuments of their own magnificence. You study the classics of your literature, that's how you learn, right? I mean, when Keats wrote, he began by imitating Milton, Chaucer, and so on, and gradually acquire his own voice. So we need a canon as a kind of yardstick by which young poets begin to write. And then we hope they move away, right, and develop their own voices, okay? Because not everyone will go to a creative writing workshop, right, or a creative writing program, and you learn from studying, right, the poets of the past.
And I totally agree with you, both of you, that the canon should not be ignored. The canon is there to be taught because we do not want people to be ignorant. That's the most important thing. But I think what's very interesting is when you speak of the canon, you're also speaking of what is taught to people. And so the question isn't, apart from what is taught, what belongs in the canon, it's also how they read the canon that's very important. And that's where the critical studies and literary criticism is very important, because then you can interrogate the canon. Just like you said, certain works do not stand the test of time. It's important because people get more intelligent about works that even belong in the canon. But might I talk about how the canon may be expanded? And there are some strategies to expand the canon, including underrepresented voices, for example. Like women, at least in the Western canon, have always been wondering, why are there only so few women in the Norton anthology, for example? Surely there are good women writers out there. And that's very important, queer writers, writers from the working class, writers from overseas, right? And also another way of looking at the canon is alternate readings of the canon, like you mentioned, alternative readings. You're reading the work, but you're reading through a critical lens, whether it's a feminist critical gaze or a queer gaze or psychoanalytic gaze or deconstruction. We're reading it with much more intelligence, right? And another way is to create a counter canon, if the canon does not include enough women, then have an anthology of just women writers. And that's where you mentioned Tiger Moth Review, and Esther Vincent is wonderfully having eco poetry there. So I see anthologies, like you said, Tai-An, as canonical even. So that is a canon trying to elevate eco-writing. There's also Mahogany Journal by Prasanthi Ram, I think, that only takes South Asian writers. So that's a canon for that voice, right? And here we have Shilpa Tapliel, who's come up with her own beautiful book. So there's a book that we're all reading, so that's lovely. For me, I look at the canon stylistically, and I like to think of the new poetry forms that I've created and Kaicha have created, creating a counter canon in aesthetics and stylistics. So I created the Anima Methodi, the Singbo, and the Found Sonnet. He created the Zoetrope and the Twin Cinema, and the Twin Cinema is an anthology. So all of a sudden, these books are there, and they add to the canon. They're not saying, let's kick out the canon, right? It's just, let's have more in the canon, yeah.
So for you, you would say that the canon is kind of echoing this process of diversification. Would you say that's...
Oh, sorry?
So would you say that the canon in that case, or the renegotiated canon, echoes the process of diversification you described in terms of individual writers in the scene?
Yeah. The more, the merrier.
That's wonderful.
In fact, the Singapore literary scene is unusual in that minority voices are very much heard. For instance, you will have noted that a lot of the outstanding poets are gay, and that has not prevented them from winning, to the sheer quality of their work, Singapore Literature Prizes. The most recent one being Marilyn Tan, and of course, past winners have been Ng Yi Sheng, Cyril Wong, Ko Ji Leong, whose poem was selected by the Guardian newspaper in my other house, was selected by the Guardian newspaper of England as the poem of the year. And his collection of poems, was selected by the Financial Times as the poetry volume of the year, along with 3 others published in London. Right. So one of the comments I made in my little book is that gay writers, have acquired a kind of literary prominence, perhaps because literature is a safe space for them. And that is where aesthetic and literary quality matters rather than, what your sexuality is, right? And perhaps there is time, for the conventional to realize that there are these so-called fringe or minority voices, right, which deserve to be heard, and in fact add to the richness and diversity of voices, in the canon, right? And I think in Singapore there is really no discrimination against women writers.
I think women writers, some of them may disagree. I would just say that
Because there are very strong women writers: Lee Su Ping, Leong Yew Gyok, Marilyn Tan, Grace Chia.
Yeah, but I'm sure they would say they are discriminated against in some other ways. But I guess maybe that's for another session altogether.
Yeah, that's more social question, right?
But I would just say that maybe the word canon might be too limiting. Because for me, a journal is just a journal. A journal is not equating a canon. So for me, a canon is not my problem, right? It's maybe somebody who wants to kind of some kind of endorse some kind of school of thought, but actually it's quite artificial. I mean, I can create sub-canons of a lot of things. So I mean, when I hear things like queer canons and women canons, for me, I don't know whether if I were a women poet, would I want to be known as a woman poet and be anthologized in a woman-only anthology? So some women don't have problems, some women will. So, and canons to me are a very abstract thing for me. I'm also very suspicious or very skeptical of anthologies which have a particular polemical approach. So I don't know. I don't think it is enough time, but I'm sure we will have a healthy debate afterwards.
It is complex. It's complex. Yeah, it's definitely not a
but you have a good point. You have a very good point. A canon is really something that is made up, right? I mean, we have the historical precedent of the metaphysical poets being ignored for 2 centuries, and suddenly T.S. Eliot and some other modernist poems discover them. And nobody, the 18th century didn't like them. The 19th century, forgot about them. And suddenly in the 20th century, they emerged. And they were not in the canon, and they're now very much in the canon. So it's a shifting thing. And also in some ways, it's an ideological thing, to do with national sentiment. You want to promote certain kinds of poets because of certain kinds of themes that they write, their approaches and so on and so forth. And influential critics support them. Or they might be extremely popular, like Catherine Lim, for instance, and so on. There are all kinds of reasons why people are in a canon. And you're right, a canon is an artificial construct. But it is always reputed to contain the so-called best efforts, best writers, best poems, that a body of writers, critics, who are supposed to be competent in making such judgments, right, like judges at international and national literary prize competitions. They are expected to know what they are doing when they put certain names within, say, the Oxford Book of English Poetry, right, or the Singapore Anthology of Poetry. So, yeah, I agree with you. It's very much an artificial construct, but it is based on general agreement, and one can disagree.
And just one. I agree that the canon is essential to a culture, right? Because a community needs that canon to share a set of references and resonances. But then the question is also whether it has to be a canon of high culture, and it doesn't have to be, because we know that the canon has included very sort of remarkably different work, diverse voices. But every time something makes it into the canon, it's seen as it's attained a certain stature. It's now high culture, by which every other writer sort of looks at. I mean, whether they like it or not. But the truth is, I think that as a community, shared references and a shared set of ideas usually evolves naturally in the community, like Singlish, you know? It's like language, and a lot of it is derived from popular culture, not necessarily high culture. For example, literature was really big early 1900s, and of course all the way before that. But then TV came. Then there's the advent of radio, and now new media. And we can see, you as a music critic, you can see just the sheer reach of popular culture as a unifying cultural force. And that alone is formidable. And in Singapore, you can see things in our time like Phua Chu Kang, Under One Roof, Army Days, Our Boys to Men. Those were talking points. People rallied around, the jokes there. It really built a whole generation of people who looked at Singapore that way. And does literature allow popular culture into its corpus of work? I don't know. That's just a question I'm putting out there, right?
Well, I'll just say that Shakespeare was not writing for high society.
Yeah.
He was a working man. He was a journeyman. He was dishing out works to be staged next day.
The gallery.
So it was literally, yeah. So that's how things become gentrified. So canon, to me, is a process of gentrification. But it can also be, some of the works can also decline. Such is the nature of quality, right?
Well, there's one development in Singapore poetry that we have not touched very much upon, but we did touch upon it, and that is the growth of spoken word and spoken poetry, and the way that poetry now and poets are teaming up with those practicing other arts. I was reading about Mark Nair and the dancer, okay, and then of course, Desmond, you started this trend of ekphrasis, right, where poets respond to, write a phrastic poem responding to paintings, right? So there has this, and this is the sort of thing that can be recorded electronically, but how long it will last, like print, is another matter, because these are not meant, as it were, to be immortalized, so to speak, okay? It's the performance, and you enjoy it for the moment, right? Like a play, right? And then it's gone, okay? But it's become part of the cultural experience of the audience, the performers, the community, which is aware of it, sees it on TV, sees it reported in the papers, and so on. And that's a dimension of poetry that it seems to me has developed, the poetry slam, which allows for popular participation. People who go up to the mic, open mic, for instance, may not see themselves as poets. They just see themselves enjoying, for the moment, creating something with language, interacting with language, right? And that's for the moment, like a jazz singer, right, and so on. So I saw that as another development in Singapore poetry, which is not recorded. Although some do publish, like Puja Nancy, and several of these poets even have their own bands, right? Right.
Yisheng is trying to put an anthology of spoken word text. I'm not quite sure. Yisheng could reply, Yisheng, if you're watching.
Online.
But I think he is trying to do a kind of overview of the development of spoken word in Singapore. But I don't know whether it's out yet.
Interesting project. And now electronics makes it possible.
Yeah.
Fantastic. It's cheap and free.
Yeah, has the canon included enough spoken word performances? Like I just told Steph, her Hokkien Me poem is very famous. Yisheng has that famous long poem that he's performed multiple times. I don't know if the canon has allowed them in it.
Well, it will create its own canon.
Yes.
Separate from written printed word canon, right? Already Puja Nancy will be in it, right? Yisheng will be in it.
I think both, if they are so distinct, have learned from each other. In fact, I think they cross over. So, like you say, some of the spoken word have become published, printed authors, right? And some of the poets have learned how to project themselves like for instance, you read very well, yeah. So don't stick your tongue in the public. Yeah,
Yes.
So essentially, they are learning from each other.
Yeah, one of the talents a poet has to acquire, is to have such a command of language that you could turn from colloquial to formal, and play tricks with language and so on. Sometimes spoken word doesn't translate well onto the page. Sometimes words on the page don't translate well to being read in public. And not all poets read their
The same
own
goes for printed poetry.
Exactly, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
That what looks good in print when you read silently in your mind, may not go down very well with an audience when read out loud, particularly, if the poet has not been able, right, to write in such a way that it can be read effectively. Right? Some poems, like a complaint about the metaphysical poets is that it's so intellectual, right, that you can't read them. They're not lyrical at all. They are so intellectual that they verge on the abstract, like some of Desmond's poems.
Thank you very much. All right, I think we're moving towards the end of our session. So as one thing to wrap us up, I would like to invite each of you to think of one word you would use to describe the future of poetry in Singapore, and then share that.
I've got a whole slew of words.
All right, you can start then.
I did your question like homework. Okay, so I had fascinating, exhilarating, robust, promising, invigorating, uncharted, noticed and noticeable, heard, read, watched, luminous, and I end with defining of a newness with regard to its self-awareness, its relevance, and its importance.
That's almost a poem in itself.
Oh, there you go. Just for PFS. I didn't say enough about, Poetry Festival Singapore and, Eric Vallis, Chile, Michelle Loh, Latha, Azad. They just do fabulous work in bringing poetry of different languages, along with Singlet Station and the Book Council and all that, yeah. But one word from you, Kai Chai, future of poetry, what do you have?
I guess limitless, because I don't think there is any way of defining poetry these days. You can write a prose passage and you can call it poetry. So it's really limitless.
Well, years ago in 1960, there was a conference of writers in Singapore, right? And whereas the other writers in the other languages were saying that poetry is for society, poetry has to achieve something good, right, and be a voice. The writers in English, said poetry is art, and the writer should focus on this and write well on the things that touch his interest and his own heart. So I will look for more art. What the metaphysical poets in one poem call the well-wrought urn, right? That better crafted poems, right? And poems which are so well crafted, they sing, they make penetrating sense, and I would say one young poet, I'll take this opportunity to mention, who I think exemplifies this and has the talent, has the gift, will be Cheryl Julia Lee, right? We are always eating expired things, a volume that I would recommend very highly. It was shortlisted for the Singapore Literature Prize, but it did not win. And this brings me to the issue of literary editors. I think that if she had a good literary editor, she would not have published so soon. It would have been a stronger volume. Yeah.
Prof, what's your word? The one word.
Well, the word was art. That poetry
nice.
is art.
Oh my, limitless and art. Wow.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Right. That it's not just spewing anything in language. It's an art, the aesthetic, right?
Yes.
I think that has been almost forgotten. That poetry has to be doing something, has to be achieving something. It just is.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists, Ko Tai An, Desmond Kon, and Yeow Kai Chai. This has been the changing state of Singapore poetry as part of Poetry Festival Singapore 2020. Thank you all.
Thank you, Margaret.